The fiercest domestic critic of Russian President Vladimir Putin is reported to have died in one of the world's harshest penal colonies. 47-year-old Alexei Navalny was convicted of fraud and extremism. Authorities of the infamous Arctic Russian prison dubbed the Polar Wolf say they are investigating the Putin critic's death. Reports of his death inside the Russian prison have sparked anti-Putin protests worldwide. Supporters say the fiery opposition politician was systematically persecuted for challenging Putin. Prison authorities said in a statement that Navalny felt unwell after a walk. He lost consciousness almost immediately and died shortly afterwards, adding that resuscitation attempts failed. US President Joe Biden said he was outraged but not surprised.
But make no mistake, Putin is responsible for Navalny's death. Putin is responsible.
Other Western leaders also blamed Putin and the Russian state for the death of Navalny.
Yes, the death of Mr. Navalny shows the weakness of the Kremlin and the fear of all opponents.
The Kremlin said Putin had been informed of Navalny's death. He has not yet commented on the same. Moscow has meanwhile said the reaction of Western leaders to the death was unacceptable and absolutely rabid. Navalny's wife, Yulia Navalnaya, told the Munich Security Conference that she could not be sure her husband was dead. She nonetheless called upon the international community to unite in the fight against the horrific regime in Russia.
I don't know whether or not to believe the news, the terrible news that we only get from the government sources in Russia, because for years, and you all know this, we can't believe Putin and Putin's government. They're always lying. But if this is true, I want Putin and all of his entourage, Putin's friends and his government to know that they will be held accountable for what they have done to our country, to my family and to my husband. And that day will come very soon.
Очень скоро.
Reports of Navalny's death triggered protests worldwide, starting with Russia, where protesters came out in solidarity with Navalny, even at the risk of facing the wrath of the Russian state. Several protesters were detained in different Russian cities. Russians living elsewhere in Europe also came out in hundreds as soon as the news of Navalny's death came out. Other nationals joined Russians as the protests spread from Eastern Europe to the west and across the English Channel and Atlantic. Protesters were seen holding banners which called Putin a murderer. The imminent threat to Navalny's life went up in the last decade when his movement started to garner hundreds of thousands of protesters. One of the most notable incidents came to light in August 2020. Navalny fell ill on a flight from Siberia to Moscow. The pilot made an emergency landing, saving his life. The Kremlin critic was then flown to Berlin, where he was treated for the effects of a neurotoxin that German military tests showed to be Novichok, a poison developed in the Soviet Union.
And he could have lived safely in exile after the assassination attempt on him in 2020, which nearly killed him, I might add. But he was traveling outside the country at the time. Instead, he returned to Russia. Knowing he'd likely be imprisoned or even killed if he continued his work. But he did it anyway, because he believed so deeply in his country, in Russia.
Back then, Putin dismissed a joint media investigation that said it had identified a team of assassins from Russia's FSB security service. He said if someone had wanted to poison him, they would have finished him off. Edward P. Joseph is a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and foreign policy analyst. Mr. Joseph is now joining us live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Joseph, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
The West is awash with claims that Russian President Vladimir Putin killed Alexei Navalny. There's a committee that is probing his death and circumstances that led to his untimely death. But what if the report says otherwise? What will happen?
Well, I can't believe a report would say otherwise. The United States, all of its allies, all of those who are familiar with Russia and the Russian system know that Mr. Navalny was in the custody of the Russian prison authorities. He looked completely healthy. Just in a video in the court just from last week, where he was joking with the judge, looked completely healthy. Doctors have stated that it is highly unlikely that his death would have been the result of the poisoning that you referred to. So it's highly unlikely that there's any cause of this other than a order from Vladimir Putin. And again, this is what's so important about this, is what it says about Vladimir Putin and his regime. Mm-hmm. Why would he feel the need to kill a man who's in prison, who's in a prison in the Arctic Circle? And this is what I hope across what is called now the Global South, and in those countries where so many citizens have been ambivalent about the Russian aggression against Ukraine, will now open their eyes and see the reality of Vladimir Putin's regime and who he is and why he's waging this war. Alexei Navalny represents exactly what Putin is about and the fear that grips Putin of any type of opposition to his rule. Please.
Mr. Joseph, what next for Russia and all those who oppose Vladimir Putin's rule or regime?
Well, in the short run, this is very bad for Vladimir Putin because this exposes the sympathizers of Putin in the West and of course, anyone at home, but particularly in the West. And we see this most pronounced here in the United States with Donald Trump, who's been exposed now on the defensive. Now, he hasn't until now even commented on the Navalny death. So, and he's being criticized. President Biden has called him out. Nikki Haley, his Republican opponent, has called out Trump for his recent comments stating that he would encourage Russia to attack NATO states. His great sympathizer, Trump's great sympathizer, the news correspondent, Tucker Carlson, is being criticized for his passive interview of Vladimir Putin. So this is already having repercussions here in the United States. It's exposing Trump to criticism. It's exposing Republicans who have so far not approved continuing aid to Ukraine. It's exposing them, putting them in a very awkward position. So in the short run here in the United States, elsewhere around the globe, this is not good for Vladimir Putin. Of course, at home, he will has complete domination and obviously does not fear protests at home. Please.
Mr. Joseph, finally, and this is briefly, I know this is too early to talk about or even insinuate, but is there a likely or possible replacement for Navalny?
Well, there are other figures who are themselves now at risk and in prison. So it's unlikely that there is such an opponent, and which explains, Eric, your question is a very good one, because it explains why Putin would need to eliminate Navalny, because Navalny represented a unique type of threat to him, a quite charismatic and incredibly brave, as President Biden correctly pointed out, returning to Russia after having been poisoned, knowing that he would definitely be imprisoned and likely end up with this type of a fate. So that type of courage, that type of charisma and following, widespread following that he had, and particularly his attacks, very effective attacks on the abject corruption of Putin and the Putin regime. Yes, there are other opponents, but there's not an immediate replacement. And again, that goes far to explaining why Vladimir Putin, who will be running for re-election, so wanted Navalny out of the picture. Please.
All right, I've been talking to Mr. Edward P. Joseph, who's a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He's also a foreign policy analyst. Mr. Joseph, thank you very much for talking to us today.
You're welcome.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.